I want to talk about what I believe and experience as the core dynamic around the abuse and tension between myself and Peter Sandhill and later the entire facilitator body and board of directors at the Human Awareness Institute. And my first exposure to work with the inner child was through the channel Lazarus at, I think, age 13, maybe 14. I was exposed to the channel Lazarus first at Findhorn in Scotland. Then I began working with the tapes. And there's a lot of interesting ideas, consistent with different forms of channeled information. But I noticed the inner child as being significant amongst kind of that body of work because it actually had an impact. While I was being abused, shamed, traumatized at home in my adolescence, I did a weekly meditation to help to reparent the inner child and the inner adolescent. And this had quite a pivotal shift. My sense was that reality went in a positive direction by, roughly 30%. Just the decisions I made, the way that I felt in order to make those different decisions shifted. And it's in many ways the prime, I guess, fruit of esoterics and metaphysics in different forms. And so, that alerted me, Lazarus and other channeled entities such as Seth, psychologists, whether it's Freud or Jung, etc. There's a lot of stuff out there. But if you explore the New Age or alternative or holistic movement, however you want to refer to it, you can read a lot of books and it does not change the way I feel, the way I respond, my instincts. So there's head knowledge, and then there's stuff that actually leads to a shift. And so for me, I took note of the fact that kind of healing the inner child and inner adolescent seemed to have more impact per hour than anything else by far. And as a result, I have emphasized and paid attention to the inner child, which I also noticed as I began doing work with the Human Awareness Institute, specifically with Ann Watts, and in my relationships. What I observed was that for the American statistical archetype, a woman in our culture is ashamed of her femininity. And by femininity, I'm not talking about makeup. I'm talking about vulnerability. I'm talking about receptivity. I'm talking about need. I'm talking about sensitivity. I'm talking about responsiveness. I'm talking about that childlike state of falling in love, of wonder. That whole terrain of the feminine psyche that exists in men and in women is severely shamed in high schools, in the whole ethic of growing up, in being cool, i.e. descending into the reptilian brain, which is cold-blooded. To be cool is to be non-feminine, non-emotional. As a result, there's a competition in the United States as to who can be more masculine, the female or the male. And in that competition, because of the overlay of masculine chauvinism, and I say masculine because, a femme fatale, as an example, someone who is as sociopathic and manipulative as the traditional James Bond stereotype, will actually get high ranks amongst men and women in a chauvinistic cult, because the woman was more manipulative, more sadistic than the male. And so there's this whole series of movies where the chauvinistic male moves as the progression of modern day feminism, which is basically to say that, okay, we all agree that being masculine is more important than being feminine, that to be extroverted is more important than to be introverted, that to lead is more important than to follow, that to talk and not be shut up is more a position of rank than to listen and to empathize. We all agree that to be masculine is superior to being feminine, but women can be as masculine as men, and in many cases more so. And therefore, on the basis of masculinity, earn equal rank at the table. And that makes perfect sense. If you're going to have a chauvinistic cult that cuts the sphere in half, and then unscientifically and rather dogmatically elevate half of the psyche, half of the world, half of the polarity of yin and yang, to be superior than the other half. This is something that cannot be scientifically done, because a scientist says, well, if it's an ecology, if all life exists in the midpoint between yin and yang, between masculine and feminine, if it's an ecology, it is unscientific to say that the negative pole in a battery is more or less valuable than the positive pole. That to listen in the dialectic of communication, that to listen is more or less valuable than to speak, is irrational. You do not have flow unless you have speaking and listening, leading and following. But it's deeply ingrained into the cult, the elevation of masculine, to the point where a chauvinistic woman will cringe at the idea that the feminine is somehow linked with female. And it doesn't need to be. You can have, I think the current term is badass. You can have badass women who are more sociopathic than badass men. And you can compete to be more and more masculine. But just like having 1,000 plugs and one electrical outlet is somewhat meaningless, in order to have strong flow, you need a balanced polarity of masculine and feminine, yin and yang. It's unscientific to have flow, to create value, to have chemistry, electricity. One way or another, in a polarity, you want equality in the polarity. Otherwise, scientists would engineer batteries that had 90% positive charge and 10% negative charge, and we would waste billions of dollars on throwing away batteries, because you wouldn't get the life expectancy from the battery that way. Now, there's so many levels this breaks down in, but in the cycle of maturation, the child is in a feminine state. As it goes into adolescent, it goes into masculine state, because you have the unconditional yes of the infant, and then you have the rebellion, the antithesis. You have the sympathy, and then you have the antipathy of the adolescent. So the child is in a feminine state, and as a result of the femininity association in both boys and girls, of innocence, of receptivity, of naivete, there's a strong backlash. You have older siblings tormenting, teasing, humiliating the innocence, the naivete in the younger sibling, in the child. And this is an externalization of the self-hate and the self-loathing of the child in an abuse cult. And so what I would notice in the dating arena was that younger women below the age of 45 or 50 would be embarrassed to cry, would be embarrassed to be vulnerable, would apologize for childlike states, which, if you understand the romantic progression in a normal, healthy human being, the romantic relationship follows the developmental cycle of a human being. Meaning, when you fall in love, if you allow that process to happen naturally, it's the 2-year-old projecting the deity onto the parent. And as an infant, it's an open book. You've got access to all the coding. All of the templates get set in that infant period of time. They're completely open and vulnerable. There's innocence, there's transparency, there's no guile, there's a tremendous potency of trust and of attachment. And if that template is ruptured, you lose the ability to form secure attachments. You lose the ability to fall in love. Now, you fall in love, you idealize the other as whoever you happen to have picked, but it's an archetypal relationship of the child to the parent. And then gradually you grow up, and then you go into the power struggle, the rebellion of the adolescent. And in a healthy maturation process, you then move from that into the adult. Now, the child is in a state of literal need, and this is one of the reasons that it's predicated on trust, because nothing else would work anyway. It's appealing to some sense of decency and empathy in the parent, because the child is completely helpless without the grown-ups around it. It will die, it will not learn, it will not develop. A child is completely dependent on the giants around it. And, you know, in our normal thoughts about time, we talk about the past and the present and the future. But if we understand that in the psyche, time is more like the rings of a tree, meaning if you cut a tree down or look inside a tree, the first year of the tree is still there, and it provides backbone, but it also provides shape for the rest of the tree, meaning if there's a wound at year number 2 and the tree is deformed, etc., it may, all things going well, continue to grow. But every other layer around that scar, around that wound or snap, will model that effect. And so the earlier, if you look at the psyche, the sense of self, the inner circles of the tree do not disappear, but they are initially shaped by the events in childhood. And with work with the inner child, you can go back and you can change formative events through a process of changing the biology of the body, through intense visceral visualization, or with compassionate interjection, as in the case of regression through psychedelics, where you can bring a healthy adult yourself, if you've been able to obtain the adult level of development, which is not at all common in a psychologically illiterate, uninitiated cult. But if you are able to obtain that sense of adulthood, then you're able to go back into those moments and re-look at them through the eyes of an adult. Because the childlike algorithm within the psyche has a default set point to blame itself for all faults in its reality and to project all benefits, in other words, to deify the parent or the parental figure. Now, every parent and every system and every cult is flawed. It has to be, because it is the human mind that creates the system. There have been 10,000 cults in human history. There's only around 500 of them marginally intact or left at this stage. And more die off. There's endangered species, there's endangered cults. Most of all the cults in human history are dead. But every cult, of course, believes that it is the best cult. All of the 95% of cults that have already expired in terms of languages and mythologies and ways of doing things, they all thought they were it. But obviously, they're wrong if they're dead in a survival of the fittest paradigm. So what we see is, in fact, that any system either stultifies and dies off because it becomes too dissociative with its underlying reality and becomes actually more destructive than constructive. If you start off a cult in a way that's highly responsive to its environment and increases the well-being for those who practice the cult, the environment continues to grow and evolve. So if for some reason your cult gets frozen in time, be it a religion or any other cult, it becomes more and more dissociative. It no longer is an asset the way it was when it was first formed. It becomes a liability, because reality is on an evolutionary journey, and if you do not change, if you do not evolve with it, you move into a dissociative failing relationship with the underlying reality. So the child region of the psyche, that area in the landscape, it's like the core coding area of a computer where you write the rules. And if you've got administrator clearance, you can put whatever you want in there. You can tell a computer to heat up and start ruining its parts. You can tell a computer to short out anytime someone presses enter. You can tell a computer to go crazy anytime you press the shift key. You may tell a computer to erase its core programs. When you're deep into the computer, the way a parent is with a child, they've got access to the template region of the psyche. That initial shape of the tree is the whole tree for the rest of the period going to, dip in and form a pussy sap-like structure as it bows in where a wound was and comes out? Or is it going to be symmetrical? Is there going to be grace? It's formulated in those times. And the work of healing or therapy, medicine basically, psychological, biological medicine, is all about seeing whether or not the psyche will grant you access to the deepest coding areas where those templates are set, number one. And number two, whether or not you know what you're doing. In other words, once you're in that core area, you can fuck things up, or you can improve efficiency, anomaly, you can decrease the insanity. Because most of the tragedies on the planet, in a planet heavily influenced by human behavior, occur as a result of people identifying. You see, in these early stages of development, there's no identity. There's just innocence. There's just openness. But as the giants around that infant, around that child, communicate with facial expressions, with tones, with behavior, what is and is not okay, those templates get shaped in place. Now, in a shame-based family, the number one thing that is not okay is acknowledging the shame. Because a shame-based family is based on the idea that the giants in the family, the parents, are fundamentally wrong, are fundamentally flawed within a sociopathic paradigm. Now, an empathic paradigm, if you say, I'm fundamentally flawed, you get love and support. But in a reptilian or sociopathic paradigm, you get punished and excluded from the circle if you're flawed. Shame-based people, by definition, experienced a large degree of exclusion, a large degree of sociopathic behavior. In other words, to be a mistake is fatal in a sociopathic paradigm. Because you didn't just make a mistake and then you could be forgiven and then you could learn. When the intensity of shame, of trauma, hits a child in a sociopathic, in a traumatically illiterate cult, at a certain intensity, there's no distinction in the identity between making a mistake and being a mistake. Now, the amount of trauma and shame necessary to blur that boundary only emerges out of a sociopathic environment. Meaning, parents who are afraid for their own survival, socially, economically, physically, emotionally, mentally, transfer some of the burden of that weight onto their children because they're psychologically illiterate in a cult that refuses to give them a single competent hour of emotional literacy in school. So when someone is overloaded and traumatized, they pass on some of that load to whoever will take it. And it's usually whoever is in closest proximity. Whoever is closest to a traumatized person will get the biggest fallout from that trauma. And that's just the way psychology works. So by definition, the parents that are in overload, that are in their own trauma, experience the world around them that induces that trauma and fails to lift it off as sociopathic, which means the parent in a traumatically illiterate state is left to deal with a threat to their identity. As a result, it goes on to the infant. When this goes on to the infant, when the giants need the infant, need to put weight rather than lifting the infant up, when they are incapable of dealing with life, that goes into the infant at an intensity that's shame of being, which is a trauma, which communicates to the child that they are fundamentally flawed and that they are in a reptilian environment where to have that flaw be visible is the end of life. And so it must be protected. The flaw must be hidden at all costs because it is shameful in a sociopathic paradigm where to be weak, to be feminine, to be vulnerable, to be needy, to not know, to make mistakes is to be bad and is to be punished in the extreme by being cast out of the circle, which for an infant is death. You take a 2-year-old and throw them out of the boat, throw them out of the family circle, throw them out of the house, they're dead. If animals don't get them, they quickly starve to death, etc. And it's for that reason that there is this blanket acceptance and openness. So a good therapist understands that the adolescent has covered this terrain because the adolescent wakes up and realizes, hopefully, some people never leave the childlike state. They remain primarily regressed, shame-based children for life. Now, this has far-reaching consequences, beginning with the abuse contract they sign with their parent, which can then be projected onto various parental figures. The abuse contract that every shame-based child signs with the parent outlines the rules. For example, a shame-based parent who is terrified that they will die, be cast out of the circle, if their mistakes are known, a shame-based parent, you can think of Donald Trump, cannot acknowledge making a mistake. They never do anything wrong. Because if they did, or if it was found out more accurately, if anyone found out, they know what the consequence is. It's death. And so a shame-based child who makes just as many mistakes as everyone else, has to go insane in order to hide their shame, the thing that could get them killed. Now, as one gets older in that type of environment, the extreme innocence of trust backlashes in direct proportion to the sadistic cruelty within the betrayal of innocence. So if that child was truly trusting and open and wanted to believe and kept wanting to believe, and every time they did, they were betrayed, they were used. The little girl or the little boy who is incestuously raped for their own good, because we love you. As the person develops into the adolescent, this hardens into rage because the adolescent is not yet an adult, so it cannot protect the inner child. It's still dependent on the parental environment. You know, like at age 14, etc., I was aware of the abuses going on at home. I even ventured to kind of lay them out to my father. You know, the pattern of interaction with my younger siblings who were still in the innocent phase of the abuse, but were very much active participants in enabling the abuse, because that's what my father wanted. He rewarded them if they enabled his abuse, and he punished them if they didn't. And so they enabled the abuse. You can program anything into the innocence of a child. And so I got as far as a stalemate with my father in terms of, he said he was, interested in metaphysics and all that. In fact, I'd learned about, channeling and the like through my father. But when I pointed out the things that he did that induced in his children the very things he shamed and blamed them for, he didn't know how to deal with it. Because what's coming up in him in the memory of being a shame-based, traumatized child is, I'm doing something wrong. I'm fundamentally flawed. And if I don't find some way out of this, I'm going to die. Because it doesn't matter your chronological age. What matters is your psychological age. And your psychological age stops at the moment you dissociate. So when trauma is so big that it blows a fuse, the portion of yourself that dissociated stops growing. When it stops growing, it stays at the level of development and fear and pain, as it was when it was dissociated. Because we don't teach people to reset and reconnect the fuses. We just blow one after another, and then those parts just stay in a regressed place. It's incredibly high cost to power, to energy, to well-being, etc. These parts are overloaded, and you try and start flipping the fuse back, and you're met with this terror of regressed trauma. And if you're psychologically and traumatically illiterate, as I and most of us are, it's systematically induced in our cult, then, if you start turning the switch on and you're rather crude and simple in your understanding of psychology, you just say, that doesn't feel good. I'll just leave that terrified, dissociated part of myself over there and quickly focus on these other things, and I'll never go back for them. And that template of abandoning the inner child is initially modeled by the parent. who never goes back for their own inner child, who every time their own inner trauma, their own regressed states get triggered, turns on their external children with the same fear and consequent hate as they direct at the inner bubble of their own dissociated feelings coming up on the inside. So to a young and immature ego, trauma is a death sentence. It is an energy that is so big it threatens the ego. We need help with that. But we often don't get it. What we get is more violence, more violation, more shame. If you go to your parents in a dissociated state, and they're afraid of this state because they haven't dealt with it in themselves. So I'm scared, I'm needy, I'm this, I feel like I'm going crazy, I'm overwhelmed with terror. They will humiliate you. What do you mean? You're 14 years old. Grow up. Deal with it. I'm busy. Get out of here. And they may even fly into a rage if they really feel uncontrollably induced through mirror neurons into those same areas within themselves. The message is, do what we do. Dissociate from the pain, dissociate from the grief, dissociate from the empathic brain, move into the reptilian brain, find a fight, flight, freeze, fawn survival mechanism, keep busy, addict to something, and just move on by. And be cheerful about it, because we're positive and have a great mental attitude and etc. And, like myself in my teens starting a business, Trump was very influenced by success with a positive mental attitude. And, you can hear the similar language. It's success with PMA, positive mental attitude. And that's going to solve these things. And, its problem comes when the alternative, when failure is fatal, as it was in the Trump household. So, why do I think that the inner child is the single most important dynamic? Well, it is the stem cell of the psyche. If the inner child is healed effectively, then a new self can regrow based on the new template. Every time you have a romantic relationship, if it is healthy, you will go through the entire age development in a microcosm. The first hour to 1 year, for example, may be in the falling in love. Could last an hour, could last a year, but I see the deity. Then you're going to move gradually, you're going to mature within that relationship into the antithesis. What was I thinking? Perfect person. Nonsense. And then you're going to go into all the reasons it was unfair and this. There's also the abuse contract that gets unconsciously passed from parent to lover. So if the only way dad would adore you is if you did not notice that he was lying again, lying being taboo. We don't lie in this house, except he was lying again. And if you, Dad, I thought you, and then he gave you a little cuff and sent you to your room, letting you know in no uncertain terms through the pattern of behavior, it is taboo to point out my mistakes. Well, then the child in the early stage of falling in love in a romantic relationship will also not look at the mistakes, because that contract was never acknowledged and broken, because the childhood trauma was never resolved, was never healed. And as a result of that, that portion of the psyche, parts of the inner child, have never grown up. And those parts are as dependent on an external father or mother figure to survive as we were in a childlike state. Now, this is particularly the case when the growing adolescent, in order to be accepted in the family circle, must dissociate from the childlike feelings that the parents are committed not to feel, from the childlike feelings that the teachers and the other students are committed not to feel. In other words, in a shame-based, emotionally illiterate cult, all of the child wounding is taboo because there's no adult to deal with it. And so rather than acknowledge the incompetence of the adult, there is the fatal internalization, the flaw that I'm fatally flawed. That's why things aren't working. And if anyone finds out, I will be destroyed. Now, one of the interesting things that Peter Sandhill shared with me, early on in the session, was he said that he had asked Sarah Sandhill, his wife and fellow therapist, to try and hold his wounded little boy. Because if you're born in this cult, you have at least one side of your inner child that is the wounded little girl and the wounded little boy. And they don't develop through shame, abandonment, betrayal, and neglect. They actually deteriorate into shame, into isolation, into insanity, into self-harm, or into externalization, the violation of other people. In other words, if you take an orange and you partition it and don't plant it and let it grow, it just turns moldy and rots. It deteriorates. It does. Jung says that every part that is unloved and unwelcome will take on shame, will become hostile, and will deteriorate into hate towards that which shames it and isolates it. So the wounded parts of the self that are cast out and buried and betrayed and made fun of in order to fit in with the sociopaths, the cool ones who don't have any feelings, where everything's perfect. That split and that dissociation is a form of betrayal of the wounded inner self. And it deteriorates and forms a hatred towards the part that is trying to disown it. Much like the shame-based children of superhuman parents who try and look perfect to the world and constantly lash out at their children for not being perfect enough to make them look good. Those children, often anorexics, they understand that they have no innate value, that their only value comes from making their parents look good, and they understand it's not good enough because the parent knows they are fatally flawed. So no amount of looking good and putting on an appearance answers the anxiety. And the helplessness the parent feels as a child is in the position of destroying their image is immense. And helplessness and fear lead to hate. So the amount of hatred that goes from from superhuman parents in a codependent relationship with their children who they need to make them look good, which damages the development of the child, which makes it harder for the child to make them look good, because they're being preyed upon by the giants that are needed to nourish them. So Peter Sandhill had shared with me that he kept giving his inner little boy to Sarah for love and support. And she kept dropping that little boy. She'd dissociate. She'd lose attention. She wouldn't pay attention. Now, to a 1 or 2-year-old, that is death. And so it's a trauma every single time. Every single time a 1 or a 2-year-old gets that the giants they depend on for life is not paying attention, that's traumatic. Because their entire future depends on the giants around them paying attention. And if they won't or can't do that, there's a threat of death. Now, one of the reasons for the coding bias that in which a child, an infant, will always take on and blame themselves for the flaws of their parents is a simple one. If you as a 2-year-old grasp, I'm being raised by morons, they are so fucked up, they don't even know they're fucked up. And because they're that fucked up, they are one of the biggest threats to my psychological development, for my chance to be a human being and not just a human animal in a state of regressed trauma. And there's nothing I can do about it. And I'm stuck with them for 18 years. And I'll almost certainly be fucked up by them. And I'm helpless. Well, what's the natural response to that? Anger, questioning, how dare you? Why did you have me as a child, this and that, the other? For a shame-based, incompetent parent, that results in immediate attack and hatred and fear of their child. Well, that further wipes out the chance of survival. Now, even if the parent doesn't do that, the hopelessness that comes from recognizing that you're just screwed because of the family you were born into and the statistical odds of being messed up in this way and that way and this way, which are so high, it's overwhelming. And it creates despondency and depression and just a sense of giving up. However, if the child takes on that these are perfect, wonderful, loving people, and if there's anything wrong, it's me, well, then I can keep loving and trusting these abusive people. And they'll have some use for me, maybe just as a shame deposit. Anytime they feel too much fear and shame, they give it to me through incest or beatings or whatever it is. And then they want to get righteous and feel powerful. You know, they get abused at work and then they come home and then they abuse me and they get to be the powerful one because I'm so small. That's my use. That's how I'm to be used in this family. So that's my contract. Well, that's the basis of survival. And the thought of the shame-based child is, I'll try to be better. I'll try to be more and more perfect. And then one day these wonderful human beings who haven't made any mistakes by their own words will love me because I'll be good enough. I'll be perfect. Again, moving towards anorexia for women and trying to buy the right stuff and sound cool and all of this stuff. A reaction. It's all my fault. My parents are perfect. I need to be good enough, and then these perfect people will love me. Well, of course, that's never the case. Infants are born with incredible potential. And one cult after another in human history, and certainly the majority of the time in our cult, these kids are given so many mixed messages just through facial expressions. You know, the child feels deep grief about something, makes the parent uncomfortable because there was a deep grief in their own childhood that their parents communicated to them was life and death. You must not show this. And it's one of the most common things you'll find around the world. If you watch scenes of dying or persecution and stuff, and the children cry, you'll find Chinese parents, telling their children, don't show the enemy, don't show your weakness, don't do this. It's taboo. And in a sociopathic dynamic, that's the case. Why don't you run when you're confronting a bear? Because if you're dealing with a reptile, with the reptilian brain, as soon as you run, you're communicating to the reptile that you think you're smaller than it. And the reptilian brain fights what's smaller than it, the role of the bully, and runs from what's bigger than it. So if you run, you're telling the reptilian brain and the predator, I can win this, or they wouldn't be running. If you hold your ground, the reptilian brain will say, if they were smaller than me, they would be running. So I must be missing something. And if you hold with complete confidence, you can stop a bear. You can stop a tiger by saying, I'm the big one here. And the animal will drop its gaze. So this is psychology for a reptile. So when a little boy or a family is being evicted or something of that, and the child is crying, it's telling the reptiles around, this is prey. And so the parents are effectively saying, because you are in a reptilian cult, where your vulnerability and your weakness is met with predatory cruelty, don't show flight. Head at it, punch back. And in a reptilian cult, that works. But what you have to murder in your psyche in order to cut off those feelings and put on the facade, you must murder the empathic brain. You must murder your humanity, which resides in the empathic brain. The reptilian brain is only capable of power dynamics in a sociopathic cult, in a sociopathic environment, in relationship with the world. The empathic brain is the one that is capable of love. So, in a chauvinistic cult, we learn as young people how to mask and hide the feminine psyche, and how to be sociopathic, to be cool. It's a difficult thing to learn because it's our nature to be human. It's our nature to empathize. But if you pummel enough hate, enough cruelty, enough coldness, enough dissociated betrayal at a human being, it becomes too painful for their empathic brain, and they shut down. And once shutting down, they become a reptile. The reptile brain comes online full steam to take over, because that's its cue. You, empathic brain, are in so much pain, you can't deal, you can't process the reality. I have no pain. I'm a reptile. I can manipulate and keep us alive in a reptilian environment. So, good for Peter, attempting to do work. If you've never had a parent who can hold the 2-year-old with true empathy and care, you cannot hold it for yourself because you've internalized the template and the message of the parent who associates the opening up to their own inner child with death. They look away, they go here, they drop it because it wasn't held for them. Why? What does it take for a parent to turn away from an infant? It takes strong fear at a level that dissociates them from empathy. In other words, the message, I'm in a reptilian environment, gets passed down and gets passed down. It's very difficult to do for oneself something you have no template for, something you've never known. And so we need help in this terrain. We need someone else to love and hold. The part of ourselves we cannot love and hold because it was never given to us. It's like the English language. If no one has ever spoken the English language to you, you have no template. And the statistical odds of you being able to invent and then speak the English language without one person ever doing that for you, it's billions to one. The statistical odds of being able to create and hold a template for loving the nonverbal infant states that are the most vulnerable within the psyche, when no one modeled what that looks like or lives a life that reflects that. It's 1 in a billion. It doesn't happen, so you need help. So Peter Sandhill's asking for help from Sarah. She can't give to him what nobody gave her. So she drops it, and she drops it, and she drops it, and she drops it. And Peter talks about having a boundary. You cannot get anywhere near my child because you're unsafe as a mother to my child. Now, that's healthy, that's appropriate. The trouble is, though, just because you ban other people from loving your inner child because they're incompetent, which is the vast majority of the population, the vast majority of the time, it doesn't mean that you know how to love your inner child. It just means your child is stranded in a world without adult love, which means it's stranded in a world of trauma, which means it's stranded in a world of dissociation and of high fear, of high fight, flight, and freeze stimuli, which is to lose a lot of our humanity. Now, why do I like people in our cult over 50? Well, the first 30 years in particular, we're trying to look cool and fit in, which is all about being sociopathic towards the inner child. Then, at around 50 or so in our cult, we transcend the cult somewhat. We're not quite as frightened and traumatized by the cult and its rules. We started saying, fuck it. I like this part of myself. I don't really care if nobody else does. And if once we start becoming internally referenced, because as a child, you're born internally referenced. I like this, so I'm going to do it. I don't like it, so I'm not. Now, in a sociopathic framework, this is met with trauma. Don't do that. I don't care what you want. I want this. And I don't even care what I want. This cult will kill you if you do not do this. I don't want to die. I don't want you to die. I don't want to have to deal with you dying. So do it like that. Hey. That. Hey. The brutality fit in with the cult is dissociative. An infant will abandon their internal self-reference and they will switch to, what do I have to do to not be hit? What do I have to do to survive? Now you're externally referenced. You no longer follow here because that could get you killed in a reptilian cult. You're now out here. What do I have to do to be loved? Do this, this, this. Nope, you didn't do it right, this and that. You're always blamed for the incompetence of the teacher, the incompetence in the cult. Most parents are terrible teachers, and so they don't explain even why you're doing this or how fucked up it is, and it's all your fault. It's just terrifying. Well, by about age 50, you start to say, you know, this cult is largely insane. It's completely nuts. I'm going to enjoy being me. If you don't like it, that's fine. And maybe you've earned a little money, a little fuck you money at that point, so you can do what you want to do. And so you can afford what was a traumatic event. You can face the message, I'm going to die if I listen to myself, and you go back to that. Now, what always feels good to a healthy human being is to love and adore the little child inside. And so then you start to see life again, inner growth, not panic and stultification and anxiety. You start to see life. Because every time you worship the innocence in the inner child, you water the stem cells of the psyche. Now, billionaires are flying various places overseas to get stem cells from children and young adults who have healthier bodies, because stem cells can grow into anything. And that's the power of innocence. Innocence, trust, naivete, bonding, can learn any language, can learn any skill, can transform a life. Innocence can learn anything. It can become anything that it is asked to become, which is why it becomes so sick when asked to become sick to relate to sick parents and later sick partners and teachers and governments and friends. Innocence can become anything. It is the most sacred water of life within the psyche. And MDMA and other substances, they shut down the defenses that keep the witness from going into that terrain. And the reason that the abuses were and remain as devastating as they are on my life is that Peter Sandhill made a number of promises. Ann Watts made a number of promises. And ethically and functionally, the role of a healer, of a therapist, is to put the best interest of the client as the number one priority in order to earn and be worthy of those vulnerable and innocent parts of the psyche. And my body did not trust Peter Sandhill, but my program, my contract with my father, never to directly challenge, because if his flaw was revealed, his love would shut down. Because in a shame-based framework, if he was flawed, he was unloved. If he's unloved, he cannot love. So the whole trick is not to reveal Dad's flaw, and then he can love you. Now, the cost of that is Dad is sociopathic. Dad is narcissistic. Dad doesn't know what he's doing over here. Now, if you admit that, you avoid the mistakes, but then you're left with this tremendous overwhelm and crisis. Dad doesn't know what he's doing, but neither do I. And there's no container for the child. It's overwhelmingly terrifying. So in a therapeutic relationship, you go back into those very vulnerable parts of the psyche. And if the therapist knows what they're doing, and if you knew what you were doing, you wouldn't need a therapist. If the therapist knows what they're doing, those models get adjusted for your benefit. If the therapist doesn't know what they're doing, or has belief structures in their own shame-based nature, or has dissociated feelings from their own childhood traumas, they're committed that they will never feel again. This is every traumatized, wounded child who is abandoned and shamed for their trauma commits as an adolescent, I'm never going to feel those ways again, which means I've got to attack, abandon, dissociate, go crazy. I've got to do all kinds of things in order to never feel those feelings again. You know, that I would say is the golden rule in my family. Both of my parents will never feel this, 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 and this. So when those feelings come up, they have to be given and transferred to the children, and then the children can be punished for feeling them and dissociated from, to make sure that they get how unlovable those things are. Because no one could love them in the family lineage. So they're bad, they're horrible, and they should be, you know, my mother creates fantasies. Because in her fantasies, she's safe. Now, the problem is she's never had a real relationship with anyone because reality is doomed. But she's had many interesting fantasies. And, you know, the only time I've really seen her in her body is in rage and hate because she's terrified of existence. She's terrified of who she is and who the other person is. And so she invites people who want to relate to her into her fantasy world. Would you like to be a nice little prince? I don't want to see how you're actually feeling, but here's how you can appear and pretend to be feeling, and then you'll fit my nice little fantasy. You don't actually have to or get to exist. Just act in my play. And then we can both pretend that you're existing. It'll be our nice little fantasy. Well, this is insane. But it is the only way to relate to my mother. So, Ann Watts and Peter Sandhill, Peter more through the drug, Ann Watts through earning that initially, gaining access to some of that tenderness, some of that childhood innocence and trust, which when Peter betrayed his marriage, betrayed the law, betrayed me in all of these dynamics. You know, the narcissistic father who can't make any mistakes, of course, didn't do anything wrong. He was being very, very generous and loving. And the contract said I couldn't call him out on that or he would stop loving me, which he did. But the crisis comes when your therapists don't have a template for genuine self-love and acceptance, for loving that inner child. When you don't, when your father doesn't, when his father doesn't, when your mother doesn't. I mean, forget your siblings. When no one has that template to love that inner child and that little girl, that little boy, they carry all the shame and all the toxins of the cult, which they're the least capable of dealing with. And the cycle moves forward. Now, the most violated innocence, and innocence is escalated by or the violence of innocence is escalated by sexuality, by physical abuse, and by psychedelics. All of those are amplifiers of the dynamic. So my parents escalated that primarily through emotional and physical abuse. Peter Sandhill escalated it with psychedelics and sexual abuse. Anne Watts, in that repressed place that I went into, the wound that I went into, which is really Peter's wound, which is really our cult's wound. Why is it important to talk about this? Because Peter and Sarah Sandhill are not bad people. They're doing their best, for better or worse, to try and do things for themselves or for others that no one's ever done for them. So they can't really succeed at that. They can't really give that to someone in a way that it hasn't been given to them in that area. So there's different voices and there's different personas within the psyche. And so for some people, they can be kind and generous to a confident persona or to a physically disabled persona. But if it is a needy and desperate feminine persona, that is the part that the cult hates and attacks more than anything else. And so they disowned it in themselves. And having disowned it, it has deteriorated into something that's in more pain and more fear than was before, which means they're disown it even more. So you've got a vicious deterioration cycle going on there, where this part of the self in me is just completely unlovable, and then someone else goes into need and femininity and sensitivity, and all of the hatred and fear towards that coming up in the self gets directed to the outside. You're the enemy. You're going to, by just association, you're going to remind me, if I get to know this part of you, you're going to remind me of who this is in me. And once it gets found out in me, in the sociopathic circles in which I hang, I'm dead. I'm the butt of the jokes. I'm cast out. I'm not cool anymore. I am history, because I live amongst reptiles and they're the best I've got. And that's really the crisis. That's the best we have. Nels Olson, who was my closest male kind of friend for a couple of years, he could not find an hour in a year to respond to sexual abuse and trauma from a therapist, which it just takes a tiny little moment to grasp that if your therapist fuck you over, you don't have somewhere else to go. And if you were abused as a child and that's why you needed therapy, you don't have a place to go. And people in regressed childlike states need some reassuring person. You see, but Anne Watts couldn't give that to me because she was terrified. Not for me, but for for herself. And so every time she asked me to keep a secret, every time she would not do certain things that might threaten her fear, what she was communicating to me is, I believe in fear. I believe it's not safe out here. And because of that, I'm going to use you for my agenda to keep me safe. You're expendable to keep me safe because it's that scary. Now, it isn't actually that scary. meaning, frankly, in a sociopathic cult like our own, most people just wouldn't care that much about themselves or anyone else, even if these things come out. Then there's also, the fact that people are expedient and high meet certain needs, and so plenty of people say, well, it didn't happen to me. And this doesn't have to be kept a secret for high to grow and become stronger. But if you believe it does, you give your fear to your patient. Your fear that the world is a scary place. Every time my mother refuses to see me and gets really uncomfortable and says, could you be this little fantasy over here that I'm comfortable with? She's communicating to me that the world is so terrifying that you have to live in a fantasy. That's the only thing safe. That's the only thing that's adequate. She's communicating her belief in the unsafety and inadequacy of the world, that it's that big of a deal, that everyone should be a fantasy or they're not worth relating to. So she believes that deep in her body and lives it. And an infant has to say, is the world really that terrible? Should I live in a fantasy too to survive? Because that's what the giants who are keeping me alive say. Or is it okay to actually engage with the world? Will I die? Can I, at 6 years old, face what my mom can't face at 30 years old? With her bigger body and all her money and all that? Must be really terrifying. And so fear is transferred in an environment where there is no clear template of, how do I do this? Because no one's ever done it. Now, in conclusion, the inner child is the core out of which all of the other personas grow. Unlike a tree, because of the fluid nature of physiology around deeply visualized, sensually felt events, we can go into the core of the psyche, which is in the present, in the place of innocence. And if we know what we are doing and are able to pass the many defenses of the objector, protector, adolescent, because having been fucked over in that place, the adolescent couldn't love and figure out how to love and fix the damage. But they did create barriers so that no one would ever be able to abuse us again, and simultaneously that no one will ever be able to love us in those areas again, because they're roadblocks. That's the best an adolescent can do in the absence of adult love. So the adolescent has, as many roadblocks as they feel is necessary in direct proportion to the amount of cruelty and incompetence experienced in childhood. If we can move through that and love that inner child, such that the adolescent did not have to become completely filled with hate, with cynicism, with disgust, with violence, with rage and contempt at the sociopaths that violated the innocence of the inner child, we have a whole new identity that can emerge out of that dynamic. It's possible that a new identity, just like in doing these meditations in my teenage years, the inner core shifted maybe 20, maybe 30%, and with it, a new identity of a more loved inner child. That dynamic of changing the core can lead to a shift in the identity today. And our reality is created in large part by our habit of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing, which references our identity. That's all identity is. It's a habit. It's a familiar habit. I know it's me because I did it before and I did it before. But these habits form, the early identities form around the most intense emotional events in a person's life, which is almost always trauma, particularly in a psychologically and emotionally illiterate cult. Trauma is the single biggest body of feeling and energy. And so the identity forms around it. It's called complex PTSD or PTSD, and it's on a continuum. That I am the one who is worthless because I'm hit, the one who is helpless because nobody helps me. That's me. And I feel these things and I know who I am at least, because they're the same thoughts and feelings that I had before. There's a whole science of identity that is the most powerful science that any human being can possibly learn for changing their lives, and most of us will not get a single competent hour in that science in the course of a lifetime, and many hours of misinformed gossip that can obscure that science of identity in order to fit into cult norms. One of the most important things to understand about the abused, traumatized, abandoned inner child that takes on all the shame of the parent, of the teachers, of the cult, and of their therapist is that, particularly involving sexual abuse with an older male, the shame, the taking on, fills up. It gets fuller and fuller and fuller until the psyche, the ego, can take no more shame, no more abuse. At that point, it takes the exact same printer head that has been shaming the self and abusing the self and directs it outward to get rid of the energy. And this is where we see a shocking and illuminating statistic. The vast majority of young men, juveniles, being put to death in the United States in sociopathic cults, where you blame the children for the incompetence of the cult and the incompetence of the parent. You abuse the child, no one goes to jail, despite imprinting in the most vulnerable areas the software that leads to violation, to trauma and abuse. That fills up, it goes outward. Now, the young men, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 17-year-olds, who commit the most atrocious sociopathic crimes on other people have a very interesting thing in common. The ones that have done so much that we feel justified in executing a child in our righteous search for justice. These are all boys who have been sexually abused by older men. It's very difficult for a male who has to deal with the whole homophobia of a traumatized and ignorant cult, who has to deal with the fact that all these emotions come up around homophobia and other things, but as a man, they are further shamed, meaning we are chauvinistic to everyone, both girls and boys will be looked down on for expressing feelings, among other feminine traits. But having induced exaggerated feelings of confusion, overwhelm, betrayal, etc. around an older man having sex with a younger boy. The boy also understands that he will have no social contact with his fellow boys if he is vulnerable. But he has more feelings around the sexual abuse than girls do, because the girl has to deal with incest and all of that, which is massively problematic. But it's still heterosexual in a chauvinistic cult that sanctions heterosexual sex more than homosexual and teases boys mercilessly around homophobia, particularly in my generation and generations prior, and in other places in the world. To have no friends where you can be vulnerable and deal with sexual shame and betrayal, and be teased and humiliated when you need deep love and support, is a crime on the psyche that is so cruel, that is so cold, that is so unconscionable in its wounding of the feminine psyche in the boy, that having taken in as much of that as they possibly can, they become the mass rapist, the mass murderer, desperately trying to give back to the cult the shame and the terror that was given to them. Well, a psychedelic takes you back to that 5-year-old little boy. And Peter Sandhill did sexually abuse that little boy, and did demand that that be called love, and did demand that he got paid for it, and did demand that he be praised, and did demand that there was nothing wrong. And so the toxicity of that hatred just builds up and builds up until it begins exploding in PTSD, in rage and helplessness. And that's where high came in, with its committed denial that it had anything to do with this. And that's when all of you came in, with your abandonment, with your silence, with your betrayal. And this cult is America. It's not you. It's not me. It is America. It is the byproduct of sustained, systemic, emotional illiteracy in a paradigm of chauvinism. And it's normal. You will get called out for diverging from the cult in this area. We ask every one of our people to decide whether to fit in and be profoundly chauvinistic and sociopathic, or whether to be perceived as a threat for diverging from the norm. It is a heart-breaking decision. This terrain that I'm exploring here is at the root of 90% of human suffering. It's at the root of our cult's violation of our bodies and our ecology. It is the single most intelligent area for a human being to look at healing and redress. And it is unacceptable that leaders, therapists take money to reenact this abuse without acknowledging what a big deal it is that you can actually do far more harm as a therapist than a mate. Because you're not going into those deep areas. We learn to put up walls that are socially sanctioned. Everyone just agrees we'll all have walls. And that'll allow us to not have to look behind the walls at how cruelly we're treating the parts of ourselves and each other behind the walls. Now, I would not date a woman who did not love her inner child. Because a woman who did not love her inner child could not love my inner child. And my inner child has been abused enough, first by my parents, then by my adolescent, then by me. I don't need to have a lover signed on to the job of abusing my inner child. Very, very few people know how to do that well. But it is the well out of which enduring romance blossoms. If you want to stay in love with your partner for decades, adore their inner child and touch their innocence. Honor that inner child and lift the shame from them. Let the magic of wonder open up. It comes from caring for, as a nurturing parent, the most tender parts in the child of the other. The spiritual adult that transcends the stupidity, the insanity, the cruelty of our cult, the spiritual adult lies in the innocence of the unborn child. That is a domain in the landscape of the psyche you can go to at any time. It is the one that is not in the matrix, that is not in the delusion. It is the one that has not yet taken on the burden of the system. It is the one capable of unconditional love. I feel very lucky that my wife allows me to love her in that area from time to time. And I feel lucky because the innocence of the young, even 3 years old, the innocence of the 3-year-old, can love these wounds that have been stuck deeply by the fear of Peter Sandhill and all of his lineage, by the fear and hostility of Sarah Sandhill and her well-informed teachings of what happens when you tell secrets, the fear of Anne Watts, the anger and stubbornness of Peter Sandhill's teenager, of Peter Rengel's hostility. There's just so much weight that we ask our little child to carry, and he will do it until it kills him. But we are the ones who die when the innocence shrivels up and turns rotten, turns sour into bitterness and hate. We are the ones, the gardeners of the inner children in ourselves and in each other, who must give up the sacredness of the garden, the sweetness of those flowers, and descend into the cynicism, the contempt, the criticism, and the frenetic activity that try to fill the wound of the unloved child and of the dishonored feminine in each one of us.